December 20th, 1944. A frozen clearing in the Ardennes forest. A German captain named Otto Hullmann crouches behind a snowdrift with field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching something he cannot explain. 200 meters across the clearing, 12 American soldiers are pinned behind a railway embankment. He has counted them. He knows their officer is dead. He watched the lieutenant fall 30 minutes ago, cut down by a German MG-42 dug in at the far tree line, and lie still in the snow. By every rule Hullmann was taught, those 12 men should now be doing one of three things: retreating, surrendering, or huddling in place, waiting for a new officer to be sent up from the rear. Instead, they are moving. 2 crawl into a drainage ditch and vanish. 3 shift left and open fire on his flank. A sergeant slips the other way and waves a rifleman with a Browning into a fresh position. Nobody is shouting. Nobody is using a radio. The lieutenant is still dead, and in front of the captain's eyes, the squad is quietly reorganizing itself into a flanking ambush aimed straight at the machine gun that just killed its leader. Hullmann lowers the glasses. He turns to his young runner and asks the question that German officers, in 3 other clearings that same brutal week, are asking almost word for word. Who is commanding these men? The runner has no answer. Neither does the captain. Neither, by the war's end, will any German general alive. Captain Otto Hullmann had been a soldier for 11 years, and he had never seen anything like the 12 men across the clearing. He kept the field glasses raised until his arms began to ache. The cold was the kind that got into the bones of a man and stayed there. A Belgian December that turned the pine forest into something out of an old fairy tale. Black trunks and white ground, and a silence so complete that the crack of a distant rifle sounded like a branch snapping in an empty house. The offensive was 6 days old now. Somewhere to the west, the whole weight of the German army was pouring through the Ardennes toward the River Meuse, toward Antwerp, toward the last gamble of a war that most of the men doing the gambling already suspected was lost. But here, in this one small clearing, Hullmann was not thinking about the Meuse. He was thinking about a question he could not answer. The American lieutenant was dead. Hullmann was certain of it. He had watched the man fall through these same glasses, watched him go down the way officers went down, suddenly and completely, and lie still in a way that the living did not lie. That had been half an hour ago, and in the ordinary run of things, the death of that lieutenant should have ended the fight. Kill the head and the body stops. That was the lesson. That was what Hullmann had been taught at the infantry school, and it was what the training memos said about American troops in particular. The Americans, the memos explained, were brave enough in a mass, but they were conscripts, factory workers in uniform. Take away their officers, and they would not know what to do. They would freeze. They would wait. They would surrender. These men were not waiting. They were moving with a purpose that had no visible source. There was no shouting, and this was the part that unsettled him most. In the German army, coordination was audible. A sergeant bellowed, a section responded. An officer's voice carried the intent of the plan down the line like a current through a wire. Command had a sound, but the Americans below him were silent, and they were still perfectly coordinated. 2 men vanishing into a ditch, 3 sliding to a new angle, 1 rifleman repositioning his automatic weapon as if he had been ordered there, except that no one had ordered him anywhere. They were assembling an ambush. Hullmann could see it taking shape, the 2 arms of it closing on the very machine gun crew that had killed their lieutenant, and he could see that it was going to work, and he could not for the life of him identify the man who was making it happen. He lowered the glasses and turned to his runner, a boy of 19 named Karl, who had been in the army for 4 months. "Who is commanding these men?" Hullmann said, in German. Karl looked across the snow and had no answer. Neither did the captain. And neither, though none of them could have known it that morning, would any of the senior German generals who by the following spring would be sitting in a comfortable manor house north of London, speaking freely to one another about why the war had gone wrong, not knowing that every word they said was being written down. The question Hullman whispered into the snow that morning was the question that a whole hidden history turns on. And it is a stranger question than it first appears, because of who was asking it. The German army was the army that invented decentralized command, not borrowed it. Invented it. The idea even had a name, a heavy German compound word that generations of officers had learned to say with something close to reverence. Auftragstaktik. Mission tactics. Tell a subordinate what you want accomplished. Never tell him how. Trust him to work out the rest for himself. The Germans had been training their officers in this idea for more than a century. They had built the most flexible command system on earth around it, and they had used that system to conquer France in 6 weeks and to drive to the gates of Moscow in a single summer. And yet here was a German captain, an heir to all of it, staring across a frozen field at a squad of American riflemen and unable to understand what he was seeing. To understand why, we have to leave the Ardennes. We have to go back almost a century and a half to a single catastrophic afternoon outside a small German town, and to the men who stood in the wreckage of it and made one of the most important decisions in the history of war. October the 14th, 1806. Napoleon Bonaparte destroyed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. It was not a defeat, it was an annihilation. The army of Frederick the Great, the most drilled parade ground machine in all of Europe, the army that other armies studied and imitated, met an enemy that refused to fight by the old rules and was shattered in the space of an afternoon. Something like 25,000 Prussians were killed, wounded, or captured. In the days that followed, fortress after fortress surrendered without a fight. In one case, a garrison gave up because its commander could not obtain permission to resist from a king whose government had effectively ceased to exist. The Prussian officers who survived that catastrophe sat down in the ruins and made an observation that would echo for the next 200 years. They had been trained to wait for orders. Napoleon's men had been trained to think. When the situation changed in front of a Prussian colonel, the colonel froze and sent a rider to the rear to ask what he should do. When the situation changed in front of a French marshal, the marshal simply acted. And so the Prussians made a hard and clear-eyed decision. They were going to rebuild their entire army around the thing that had just killed them. The men at the center of that work were a general named Gerhard von Scharnhorst and his younger protege, a thoughtful officer named Karl von Clausewitz, who would later write the book that military professionals still argue about today. Together with others, they took the Prussian army apart and put it back together around a single, unforgiving truth. War is chaos. The plan never survives contact with the enemy. The commander at the top cannot possibly know what is happening at the bottom quickly enough to react to it. So do not try. Instead, give the man at the bottom a clear understanding of why he is fighting and what his commander wants achieved, and then let him decide for himself how to achieve it. It took 60 years and several wars to refine the idea into a working doctrine. But by the time Helmuth von Moltke the Elder took command of the Prussian army in the 1860s, the system had matured, and it had a rule at its heart that Moltke stated with cold clarity. An order that can be misunderstood, he wrote, will be misunderstood. Therefore, do not issue detailed orders. Issue intent, state the result you want, and then get out of the way of the man who has to produce it. There was a story every German cadet learned that captured the spirit of the thing. A Prussian prince was scolding a major for a mistake the major had made during a maneuver. The major protested that he had only been following the orders he was given, and the prince replied that the king had made him a major precisely because he was expected to know when not to obey his orders. Read that again, because it is the exact opposite of the click your heels, follow every command image that later movies would attach to German soldiers. The real doctrine, the one they trained their best men in, held that an order which no longer fit the situation in front of you was no longer binding. You were not merely permitted to disregard it. You were obligated to, and obligated instead to accomplish whatever that order had been intended to accomplish. By 1933, all of this had been written into a manual called Truppenführung, which means troop leadership, and which remains one of the most studied military documents ever produced. It said, in plain language, that war is the realm of uncertainty and friction, that the commander on the spot must be free to decide, that initiative is the duty of every officer and every non-commissioned officer, and that hesitation is a worse sin than a wrong decision boldly made. This was the doctrine. This was the inheritance. And when the German army smashed into Poland in 1939 and into France in 1940, the world saw what it could do at full power. German junior officers raced across enemy country, making their own choices about which roads to take and which strongpoints to bypass, while their opponents were still waiting for orders that arrived a full day too late, always fighting yesterday's battle. So hold the paradox in your mind, because everything that follows lives inside it. The men who wrote the book on fighting without orders were the same men who, in the winter of 1944, would stare across the snow at a leaderless American squad and be unable to understand how it worked. The Americans had not done something the Germans could not imagine. They had done something the Germans had invented, had perfected, and had somehow, in the years since, quietly stopped being able to do themselves. The first clear sign of it had come not in the Ardennes, but 6 months earlier, on a beach in Normandy, where an entire American assault company lost every one of its leaders in the first 10 minutes, and then did something that its German defenders had no category for at all. To measure how far the Americans had come, you first have to see how low they started, and there is no lower place to begin than a mountain pass in Tunisia called Kasserine. February 1943. The United States Army met the German Army in open battle for the first time in the war, in the dust and cold of the North African hills, and it was very nearly destroyed. American units were shattered and scattered across 30 miles of desert. In 5 days, something like 6,500 men were lost, killed or wounded or taken prisoner. More than 200 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Green American troops, badly led at the top and thrown into positions they did not understand, broke and ran, and the veteran German formations rolled over them almost contemptuously. The German commanders walked through the wreckage afterward and drew the conclusion their own analysts had been feeding them for 2 years. The Americans had factories. They did not have soldiers. They had wealth, not warriors. Behind the lines, the Germans had a name for the men they were fighting. They called them the Dollar Army, and it was not a compliment. It meant an army that could buy victory with steel and oil and trucks, but could not fight for it. An army of rich amateurs who would always break when the steel ran out, and the fighting came down to men. Now hold that image, because here is the thing that makes the rest of this story extraordinary. 18 months after Kasserine, that same Dollar Army would put German captains behind their field glasses, staring at squads of 12 men, unable to work out who was in charge, unable to predict what those men would do next, unable even to find the leader, because there did not appear to be one. 18 months. That is no time at all in the life of an army. Something happened in that year and a half, and the first place you can actually see it happening is on a 5-mile stretch of French sand on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. Omaha Beach. 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of A Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, part of the 29th Infantry Division, men who called themselves the Stonewallers because their regiment traced its line back to the brigade once led by Stonewall Jackson. The ramps of the landing craft dropped, and the men came down them into a killing ground that German engineers had spent 3 years designing. The official Army history of what happened in the next few minutes is one of the most harrowing documents the United States military has ever produced to describe its own experience. Within 10 minutes of the ramps going down, A Company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Every officer was a casualty. Every sergeant was a casualty. The men who could still move were lying in the surf, or crouched behind the steel beach obstacles, or sheltering behind the bodies of the men who had died coming ashore beside them. Some crawled to the seawall, the low bank of round stones at the back of the beach, and were pinned there by machine gun fire, that crossed the sand in interlocking streams from the bluffs above. By every German calculation about American troops, what happened next should have been simple. With its officers dead, the company should have broken. The men should have lain in the shingle, paralyzed, until enough of them raised their hands to be marched off as prisoners, or until the incoming tide drowned the wounded where they lay. That was exactly what the German defenders had been told to expect. American soldiers, the training memo said, will not function without their officers. Cut off the head and the body dies. That is not what happened. What actually happened all along the 5 miles of Omaha that morning was one of the greatest collective acts of improvisation in the history of war. The men did not break. They did not surrender. For the most part, they did not even retreat. Instead, in 1s and 2s and 3s and 5s, with no orders, no plan, and no contact with anyone above them, they arrived independently at the same conclusion. Staying on the beach was death. Someone had to lead, and each of them, in his own small piece of the line, decided that the someone was going to have to be him. The stories survive, some of them because men who lived through it wrote them down. A sergeant named Lewis of the 116th was lying in the shingle when a lieutenant he had never met, a man named Leo van de Voort, stood up in the fire and said words that would pass into the folklore of the 29th Division afterward. There was no use staying here, the lieutenant said, because they were all going to be killed anyway. And then he ran up the beach to a German gun position and threw a grenade through the opening in the concrete. He did not ask anyone. He did not request permission. He looked at the situation in front of him, and he made the decision that a German cadet in the 1860s had been told he would one day have to make. And the men around him, who had every excuse in the world to lie still and do nothing, got up and followed him. It happened again and again along that beach. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the assistant commander of the 29th, came ashore in the second wave and walked through the chaos as calmly as a man crossing a country road, gathering knots of leaderless men and pushing them forward by nothing more than the force of his own presence. Finding a group of rangers pinned behind the seawall, he is said to have told them to lead the way off the beach, and the phrase stuck so hard that the United States Army Rangers carry it as their motto to this day. Rangers, lead the way. Farther down the sand, a ranger officer named Max Schneider had already made a colder and more important decision. His battalion had been ordered to land at a certain point to support an assault that by the time he arrived was already finished and closed. Schneider could have circled offshore and waited for new orders. Instead, he looked at the situation, judged that his assigned sector was a death trap, and diverted his entire battalion 1,000 yards east to a stretch of beach where the defenses were thinner. By doing it, he almost certainly saved the lives of several hundred of his own men. He asked no one's permission. He saw what the situation required, and he changed the plan. But here is the part that mattered most. The part that German officers, when they began questioning their American prisoners later that summer, kept circling back to with something in the transcripts that sounds almost like wonder. It was not the generals. It was not the colonels. Every army has senior officers who will improvise when they have to, and the Germans understood that perfectly well. What they could not place was what was happening below all of that, at the very bottom, among the ordinary riflemen. There was a young man named Carlton Barrett, a private in the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, 25 years old, from a small town in upstate New York. He had no special training. He held no rank worth the name. He came ashore into water over his head, under fire, and instead of scrambling for cover and trying to save himself, he spent the rest of that morning wading back out into the surf, again and again, to drag wounded men to shore before the tide took them. No one told him to do it. No one could have told him to do it, because the chain of command around him no longer existed. He simply decided what the situation required, and he did it, for hours, in the open, under fire. He would receive the Medal of Honor for those hours, one of only a handful given for actions on Omaha that day. In another sector, a private from F Company of the 116th, a man whose name did not survive, only his action did, looked at the seawall, and looked at the bluff rising above it, and looked at the men frozen around him, and stood up. They were being killed where they lay, he said. Better to move inland and be killed doing something. And then he started up the bluff, and other men followed him, and by the time they reached the top they had made themselves into a small assault force out of riflemen who had come from 3 different platoons that morning, and who were now taking their lead from a private who had not been a leader an hour before, and would not be one again 2 days later. The official history counts dozens of these moments along Omaha that morning. They have one thing in common. Not one of them was ordered. Not one came from a plan. Each of them came from an individual man, in an individual scrap of the line, who looked at what was in front of him, and made a decision he had no formal authority to make. When German prisoners were questioned about all of this later, the same puzzled question kept coming from the German side, and it was a strange question for men whose army had invented mission tactics. They kept asking the American interrogators who had been in command of those small units, who had told those men what to do. At first the American officers thought it was an odd thing to keep asking. Then they began to understand what the Germans were really reaching for. The Germans were not asking for a name, they were asking for a category. They wanted to know which slot in the chain of command those ordinary soldiers had been operating out of, because in the German mind, despite the doctrine, despite Auftragstaktik, despite 140 years of telling themselves that initiative was the duty of every soldier, they had never quite believed that initiative reached all the way down to the man who actually pulled the trigger. They had built a system that trusted captains and majors and lieutenants. They had never truly built one that trusted the man in the foxhole. The Americans had not built a system at all. That is the strange part. They had something else, and where it came from is the piece of the story that started to become visible 6 weeks after Omaha, in a stretch of French farm country that turned into a slaughterhouse. If you have seen photographs of the Normandy interior, you have seen the bocage. Earthbanks 4 feet high, thrown up over centuries by farmers, topped with hedges and trees grown together into thick walls, dividing the land into tiny fields a few hundred feet across. By 1944, the roots ran deep, and the banks were as solid as small fortifications, and there were thousands of them, field after walled field stretching for miles. The Germans falling back into that country did what the bocage was made for. They turned every single field into its own separate killing ground. What followed between the middle of June and the end of July was the kind of fighting that never makes it into the highlight reels. No sweeping tank charges, no 1,000-plane raids. Just 10,000 tiny battles in 10,000 tiny fields, American squads against German squads who could not see one another until they were close enough to hear each other breathe. The American advance slowed to about a mile a day, and in some divisions the cost per mile was worse than anything the men's fathers had endured in the trenches of the First World War. And it was in that country that the second piece of the puzzle came into focus. German junior officers writing their reports during those weeks, and German prisoners questioned afterward, kept describing the same thing over and over. They would set up a machine gun behind a hedge bank. They would take fire from a flank they had not expected, from a position their training told them an American squad should not have known to occupy. They would shift to meet that fire, and take more fire from the other flank, from another position they had not anticipated. And by the time they understood the shape of what was happening to them, a third group of Americans had already worked its way through a gap in the hedges 100 meters behind them and cut off their retreat. They were dead, or they had their hands up, before they ever located the men who beat them. The German officers writing those reports kept reaching for the same word: improvised. The Americans were not following a plan the Germans could recognize. They were not maneuvering by any pattern the Germans had been trained to identify. They were simply appearing where they were not supposed to be, having made decisions that no one could trace back to any written order. And the reason this confused the Germans so deeply is that by 1944 they knew exactly what a mission tactics unit was supposed to look like in action. It was supposed to look like a German unit. It was supposed to have a clear leader, an officer or a senior sergeant. visibly making decisions and pushing them down through a recognizable chain. What the Germans were watching in the hedgerows had no clear leader, or rather it had a leader who kept changing depending on the moment. Sometimes it was the squad leader making the call, sometimes a corporal, sometimes, and a German prisoner reported this with something close to disbelief, sometimes it was a private, an ordinary private who had spotted an opening, signaled to two of his friends, and acted on it without a single word from his sergeant. To understand where that came from, meet one more American. His name was Curtis Coolin. Before the war, he had worked in the offices of a liquor business in New Jersey. He had no engineering training of any kind. He was in his late 20s, a quiet man with a habit of listening to other men complain without interrupting them, and then coming back 3 days later with something useful. The complaint he was listening to in early July was the bocage itself, and one particular problem it created. When an American Sherman tank tried to climb over one of those hedge banks, its nose tilted up toward the sky and its belly, the thinnest armor on the whole machine, was exposed to any German waiting in the next field. A single soldier with an anti-tank weapon could sit and wait for that soft underside to rise up in front of him and destroy the tank at his leisure. And so American armor, which should have been supporting the infantry, could not get through the hedges without dying, and the infantry was left to bleed its way forward field by field. During a discussion in his unit, another soldier said, half as a joke, that maybe they should just put saw teeth on the front of a tank and cut straight through the hedges. Most of the men laughed. Coolin did not. He went down to the wrecked beaches, salvaged steel from the German anti-invasion obstacles rusting in the surf, cut it into heavy prongs, and welded those prongs onto the front of a Sherman. Then he invited his commanders to come and watch. In the middle of July, General Omar Bradley himself came to see it, and watched a Sherman build up speed, hit a hedge bank, and drive straight through it, not up and over it, but through, keeping its belly hidden the entire way. Bradley ordered them built at once, and within 11 days, by the time of the great breakout at the end of July, hundreds of American tanks had been fitted with the device. A liquor salesman with a welding torch had solved, in a few days, a problem that an entire army group had been throwing battalions of infantry at for 6 weeks. Coolin's story is the same story as the leaderless men on Omaha, only at a different scale. The American system had, almost by accident, produced a culture in which an ordinary sergeant looking at a problem felt entitled, and that is exactly the right word, entitled, to solve it himself. Not to wait for someone up the chain to solve it, not to send the problem to an engineer far in the rear, to solve it right there, with whatever was lying in the wreck of a beach, and then to demonstrate the solution to a 3-star general. Where did that come from? It did not come from a manual. The Americans had no tradition of mission tactics. Their pre-war officer corps had been small and sleepy and rigidly hierarchical, and their infantry manuals were detailed and prescriptive in a way the German manuals never were. On paper, American doctrine told sergeants what to do, while German doctrine told sergeants to figure it out for themselves. But the American sergeants were not getting it from the manual. They were getting it from somewhere the manual could never reach. They were the product of a country that had spent 150 years telling its young men that they did not need permission. Volunteer fire departments run by farmers and shopkeepers, baseball games organized by children in empty lots with no adult anywhere in sight, farm boys who had been running the family machinery since they were 14, mechanics who had taken a Model T engine apart on the kitchen table and put it back together, men who had raised a barn in 2 days with a dozen neighbors and no architect and no drawings. The country that produced the American infantry of 1944 was a country in which solving a problem yourself, without asking a superior first, was not a rare talent. It was an ordinary daily habit, a national reflex. Put a man with that reflex into a uniform and hand him a rifle, and the manual quietly receded into the background. The rifle was just another tool. The objective was just another barn that needed raising. He looked at the situation, and he did the thing that needed doing. The German soldier had no such foundation to stand on. The young German of the 1930s had been raised in a society that treated obedience to authority as a moral virtue, inside a state that had spent a decade telling him that one man at the top did the thinking for the entire nation. Whatever mission tactics training he received later was laid down like a thin coat of paint over a foundation that was the exact opposite of what the doctrine actually needed. He could be taught, in theory, to take initiative, but every other signal in his life told him that initiative, for a man without rank, was a dangerous thing. There is a line that has become almost a cliché in American military circles, supposedly said by an unnamed German general after the war. The reason the American army does so well in wartime, he is meant to have said, is that war is chaos, and the American army practices chaos on a daily basis. It is usually told as a joke, but whoever really said it was reaching for something true. He was trying to describe what it felt like to fight a force whose inner workings looked, from the outside, like pure disorder, and which somehow kept producing perfectly coordinated results anyway. He was watching mission tactics being performed by men who had never read a word about mission tactics, because they had never needed to. The Germans had a doctrine that aspired to controlled chaos. The Americans had simply been raised in it. And that raises the question that the whole story now turns toward. If German doctrine was so flexible, so far ahead of every other army on Earth, why was it failing at the exact moment the Americans were finally learning to fight? The manual still said the same words it had always said. Something inside the German army had changed, and the men who understood it best would only ever admit it to one another, in private, in a place where they did not know that anyone was listening. The thing that had changed inside the German army was not the doctrine. The doctrine still sat in the manual, word for word, exactly as Moltke and the men who came after him had written it. What had changed was the army itself, and the easiest way to see it is to look at two German divisions and ask not what they had on paper, but what was actually inside them. There were divisions in 1944 that were still the real thing. Their junior officers had been trained through the 1930s when the German military still had years of peace to develop them. Their sergeants had 10 or 15 years in uniform. Their captains had fought in Poland and France and survived the Eastern Front. The doctrine had been written into these men slowly, over a long time, and they could be trusted to take an objective because they had been taking objectives like it for 5 years. Give one of them a mission, and he would find the way. Now look at the division that was actually holding the bluffs above Omaha the morning Carlton Barrett was dragging men out of the surf. It had been formed only 7 months earlier. Its core had been scraped together from broken units sent back from the east, where a German infantry division could expect to be used up in a matter of months, not years. Its junior officers were a patchwork of survivors and hasty replacements, many of them promoted far faster than they ever would have been in peacetime, simply because there was no one else left to promote. Its sergeants were green. A good number of its riflemen were teenagers, or men in their 40s, given the same manual that spoke of initiative and trust and the duty to decide, and none of the years it took to make those words mean anything. This was the story across the entire German army by the middle of 1944. The Eastern Front had eaten the experienced officer corps alive. By the time of the Normandy landings, the Germans had suffered something on the order of 3 million casualties in Russia, and the men who die first in any army are the ones who lead from the front. But mission tactics demanded leaders who led from the front, and so the doctrine was quietly devouring its own practitioners. Every good company commander who exposed himself to read the battle got killed reading the battle, and was replaced by a man who had never done it before, who therefore could not read it, and who therefore fell back on the one safe thing available to a frightened man without experience, which was to do exactly what the manual said and nothing more. And there was a second problem, and the second one was worse. His name was Hitler. In the early years when mission tactics were working at full power, the German High Command had let its generals fight their own battles. They were given aims and trusted to work out how to reach them. But after the first disasters in Russia, that trust began to curdle, and by 1944, it had inverted completely. Hitler had taken personal control of decisions down to the level of individual battalions in some sectors. There were the infamous orders forbidding any withdrawal without his personal permission. There was the obsessive micromanagement from his headquarters far in the rear. There was the firing of any general who showed a flash of independent judgment. The most capable field marshals in the army were dismissed, recalled, and dismissed again, and the message this sent down through every level of the German command was impossible to miss. A wrong decision made on your own authority could end your career, and possibly your life. Waiting for an explicit order from above could not. The safe choice was always to wait. Mission tactics require trust running downward from the commander to the commanded. Hitler had spent 2 years methodically destroying exactly that. And so, by the time the Allies landed in France, the German command system had become in practice the very thing its own doctrine had been designed to defeat. It had become an army of men waiting for permission, because the men who had not waited for permission had been shot or sacked. That is the cruel irony at the center of this whole story. At the very moment the German system was hardening into rigidity, the American system was loosening into flexibility, and neither side was doing it on purpose. The Americans had never read Moltke. Most of them had never heard the word Auftragstaktik in their lives. They were simply letting their sergeants improvise because the improvisations kept working, and so a feedback loop turned in one army while it turned the opposite way in the other. By the winter of 1944, the inversion was complete, and in a surrounded Belgian crossroads town, it produced a moment that passed straight into American folklore. The 101st Airborne Division was in Bastogne because of one of the great improvised reactions of the entire war. When the German attack came crashing through the Ardennes on the 16th of December, the 101st was resting far to the rear in France, refitting after months of combat. Within hours, the men were being loaded onto trucks. Within a day, the division, minus its commanding general, who was back in the United States, was rolling through freezing darkness toward a town most of them had never heard of, with no clear orders about what to do when they arrived. The acting commander was the division's artillery officer, a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe, who suddenly found himself responsible for holding a critical road junction against 3 German corps closing in from several directions at once. McAuliffe did not wait for instructions. He looked at the map, saw that Bastogne was the hub the Germans needed for their whole drive west, and decided that his job was to deny it to them, whatever the cost. He set up a perimeter and then largely got out of the way of his battalion commanders, who got out of the way of their company commanders, who got out of the way of their platoon leaders, who as often as not got out of the way of their sergeants, the men actually deciding which holes to dig and which tree line to hold and when to shoot and when to hold fire, because the figures coming through the snow might be their own men falling back. On the 22nd of December, 4 German soldiers came into the American lines under a white flag, carrying a written demand for the honorable surrender of the town, with 2 hours given to accept before the artillery destroyed it. The note was carried back to McAuliffe. He read it, and according to the men who were there, he said, almost to himself, one word: nuts. Then he asked his staff how he ought to reply, and one of his officers said that his first reaction had been about right. So McAuliffe wrote his official answer on a piece of paper, and it read, in its entirety, to the German commander, nuts, from the American commander. When the reply was carried out and handed over, the Germans did not understand it. The American officer delivering it had to explain that in this case the word was an emphatic refusal. And this is the small, perfect image at the heart of the whole thing. Here was an army accustomed to surrenders that were either ordered or refused through proper channels, in proper language, and it had just been handed a one-word answer, written by a brigadier general, acting entirely on his own authority, consulting no higher headquarters, in language approved by no military regulation in any army anywhere on earth. They had run straight into the American command system at full power, and they could not read it. Bastogne held. Patton's army, after a stunning improvisation of its own, a wheel of 3 divisions through winter weather in less than 2 days, broke through to the town after Christmas. The German offensive collapsed, and in the snow outside Bastogne, all through that long week, German junior officers were filing the very same reports they had filed in Normandy. The Americans had no apparent organization. They could not be predicted. They moved in directions no recognizable doctrine would have suggested. They behaved as if every man on the line already knew what every other man was about to do. We know what the German generals truly thought, because the British had been recording them. Throughout the war, captured senior German officers had been held in a comfortable manor house north of London, given good food and the run of the gardens, and never told that every room, including the bedrooms, was wired for sound. In the basement, intelligence officers, many of them German-speaking refugees, transcribed the general's private conversations day and night, and those transcripts run to something like 150,000 pages. They are one of the most honest records we have of what these men actually believed, as opposed to what they later wrote in their careful memoirs. And in those conversations, when they thought no one was listening, the generals kept circling the same wound. They talked less about American material superiority than their memoirs later would. They talked less about air power and less about Hitler than they would in public afterward. What they kept coming back to was the American soldier himself, as a thing they could not categorize. One described the Americans as individuals who argued with each other and joked about their officers, and yet fought with an instinct for the situation he had never seen in his own conscripts, and he could not reconcile the two things. Another, a tank officer, described being outmaneuvered by an American tank platoon with no officer in it, only a sergeant, using moves that had no military logic he could name and worked anyway. When his fellow prisoner asked how it was possible, he reached for a single word. The Americans, he said, seemed freer, fry. He used the word like a man who had been turning it over in his mind for a long time without finding a better one. So here, at last, is the answer to the question Captain Holman asked in the snow. Who is commanding these men? The answer was nobody and everybody, both at once. And the Germans could not see it, because their whole vocabulary held only the first half. They could imagine an army with no commander. That was a mob. They could imagine an army with one commander. That was a unit. What they could not imagine was an army in which the man at the very bottom had been so completely trusted with the intent of the man at the top that the distance between them had simply closed. That is not a formation. That is a culture, and a culture cannot be ordered into being. It has to grow. I should tell you now that Captain Otto Hullmann is not a real man. His name stands in for several real German officers who recorded almost exactly the same bewilderment in the Ardennes. But the clearing was real. The squads were real. Carlton Barrett was real. Curtis Cullen was real. Anthony McAuliffe and his one word were real. Leo van der Voort, who stood up on Omaha and ran at a gun with a grenade because no one else was going to, was real. Most of their names are not in the textbooks. Most of them came home to ordinary jobs and never told the story, and were buried under stones that gave a unit and a date and a number, but not the thing they had actually done. The man in charge of those 12 soldiers in the snow was the man to the sergeant's left, and the man to his right, and the sergeant himself, and the rifleman in the ditch, and the wounded man propping himself on one elbow to keep firing until the others could move. None of them outranked the others in any way that mattered. All of them outranked the situation. That was the secret the Germans never broke, and the reason they never broke it is that there was nothing to break. There was no code. There were only 12 men who had been raised, long before they ever wore a uniform, in a country that had never taught them how to wait.